have copies here for people that want. We are holding in the middle of chapter 11, the second part of Tanya, Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. We explained in chapter 10 that the divine traits, the divine, so to speak, the 10 means by which God expresses himself, the means by which he creates, the 10 divine traits, such as the divine kindness, the divine wisdom, the divine will. All of these divine traits, the differences between them and the names that we give them are really just something that we use. They are for the benefit, so to speak, of the creation. Not, by the way, I want to point out, I haven't been pointing this out in the class because no one's really raised the question. And in general, as a rule, it's not good to raise questions that people don't have. I have trouble following this rule, but you shouldn't try and give people more questions than they're already dealing with. It can be overwhelming.
Don't worry.
Just to point out, when we say that the divine traits are for the benefit of the creation, we don't mean that they're for our benefit in an external way to us, right? In other words, God can't really describe the truth as it is, and so in his Torah he calls himself wise because that's the only thing we can understand. That's not what we mean. That's not what we mean when we say it's for the benefit of the creation. What we mean is that the very state of being created, in other words, what a created being is in its deepest essence, in its deepest being, must necessarily reflect the differences between the divine traits. Or a different way of putting this is, because we are finite, therefore we relate to our source in a finite way, and our source is in the divine traits, and the finite way of relating to the divine traits is relating to them as defined beings. Wisdom being different than kindness, being different than discipline, being different than majesty, being different than will. They're all different things because by necessity, our nature, our multiplicitous, our finite nature derives from their differences, so to speak. Necessarily as a created being, this is how we must see them, because our nature and our existence derives from those differences and from those traits. So in chapter 10 we discussed all of the divine traits are really not different one from the other, because every one of the divine traits is like the ray of the sun in the sun. In other words, what is really present in the divine kindness? Only luminary, only ma'or, only the source of light. Right? If you say that God's kindness is nothing other than the infinite expression of God, and God's wisdom is nothing other than the infinite expression of God, then what is the difference really between his kindness and wisdom? And the answer is that really there is no difference. From his perspective, the kindness and wisdom are exactly the same thing. They are merely extensions of his infinite self-expression. That's all they are. And not different expressions, the same expression. Because as we've said a few weeks now, you can't have different expressions of his infinite divine self. There's no way to be mechalik that. There's no way to divide it. In fact, if it could be different, it would show that his existence is not infinite, God forbid. Right? True infinitudes are simple and one, as we've been discussing at great length the past few chapters. So that's what we've been discussing recently. That's what we discussed in chapter 10. Chapter 11, the Alter Rebbe begins with a wondrous claim. And half of the chapter is spent explaining to you what's so wondrous about it. In other words, you could just read right over it and miss the whole power of what it is that the Alter Rebbe is, the radical thing that the Alter Rebbe is saying. Half of the chapter, in a sense, is spent explaining to you why this idea is so radical, right? Why it's beyond truly understanding. What the Alter Rebbe says is as follows. He says that not only are the divine traits absolutely one with each other and are really simply an expression of God's infinite being, with no finite nature of their own. Their finite nature is only what appears to exist from our side. From God's side, all they are is a perfect unity with his infinite being. not only is that true of the divine traits, it's true of the divine speech as well. That's what Alter Rebbe is talking about in chapter 11. Not only is it true of the divine traits, it is true also of the divine speech. Last week we began to explain why this is such an incredible claim. Because the entire reason the divine speech is called speech is because speech is the first stage of the soul. It is the first faculty of the soul that is actually directed outside of the person. It's the first thing that actually goes beyond us to attach to the other, to attach to something outside of ourselves. Unlike the emotion, the emotive, or the intellectual traits themselves, like God's kindness, like what we were discussing in the previous chapter, those traits, the reason why they correspond to the more inner, the deeper traits of the soul, such as the mind, the intellect, and the emotions, is because they are totally not focused on the other. They are the core of our being itself. And so too it is, more or less, right? You always have to put in a caveat that all metaphors about God are inexact. But so too it is in godliness, that God, in the process of creation, has divine traits that are not really directed outward, right? In fact, as we just explained, the divine traits are so not directed outward that they actually have no separation from his very being itself, right? The divine kindness is not something which is directed toward creation. How can that be so? It is as infinite as God is, right? And a different way of putting it is that the divine kindness did not begin to exist when God created a sweet apple, which the Alter Rebbe says the sweetness of the apple derives from the divine kindness. That is not when the divine kindness began to exist. The divine kindness is nothing other than the infinite light of God, which has existed for all eternity beyond time and space, right? That's what the divine kindness is. The divine speech, on the other hand, not as clear at all, right? The divine speech that we discuss in Torah is the divine speech that is directly involved in creating the world. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, right? The Alter Rebbe is making a much bolder claim. He's saying that
in the form of speech.
No, it's obviously not speech like we speak.
Okay.
But it was, in a way, it was a much more real speech. It was true speech, is the divine speech. It's the source for our speech.
So wouldn't it be called action as opposed to speech?
No. It's called speech specifically. That's a good question, actually. Maybe we'll touch on something in connection with that later in this class if we can get there. Because the truth is that by God, even his thought achieves action, unlike us, where only action is action and only speech is speech. God breaks the rules in certain ways. That's the way in which he exceeds the metaphor. We'll discuss that, God willing, in a little bit. That actually comes up in this chapter. But the reason it's called speech has to do with the precise nature of this spiritual revelation, that it is the first stage in the act of creation. In the act of God going out of himself, so to speak, to create a finite universe, a universe that exists in a state of finitude, of limitation. In that process, the first time God leaves himself, so to speak, to address the other, right? To allow the other to arise, the other being the creation, the created universe, right? The first time God leaves himself to address the other is in speech, right? That's why before he says, "Let there be light," there's no light. After he says, "Let there be light," there's light. Something comes into existence. Why? Because speech is the very mode of him addressing something outside of himself. In other words, it is because he is acting in a way that makes room for something else to exist that other things come into being, right? That's why it's speech.
Actually,
that's why it's called speech.
He didn't say Vaydaber. It said Vaydaber Elohim Vayomer Elohim.
Vayomer, Mamoros, not Dibros.
Vayomer is not necessarily, that he spoke. It's like when you talk to a person, U Amar Li. So you don't hear him, but you are mentioning that he told you in the past. So there's a difference between those two words.
There's definitely a difference between those two words. I'm not sure exactly how you would parse that difference here. They're definitely both at the level of speech. In terms of what we're talking about.
But one did you hear, and one that's like, you heard that somebody spoke.
I don't know if that's the you're saying second hand. I don't know if that's the chiluk exactly, right?
It's like, Uamarli, so I heard it in the past. morally. So you're not speaking. Please tell me.
Right.
It's like it's different.
Interesting. I don't know. It's an interesting idea. The research the difference in these two terms. I don't know the difference. So, where was I? Yes. So, therefore, we are saying something much more radical than we said in the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, we say God's kindness, or God's wisdom, which was what we were really calling it for the past 3 chapters. God's wisdom is absolutely one with Him, is infinite, and has existed forever, and is an infinite expression of God Himself, right? Here we are saying something much, much, much more radical, something that we need to say. It's very important, which is that the divine utterances are also absolutely infinite and absolutely one with Him. And what that means exactly is what we are going to discuss more tonight, God willing. So let's continue. I actually want to start by reading a little bit. Let's go to...
Before you start, can you give an example of what you just said?
An example of what?
Of that it's his utterances.
Yeah.
And what he...
When God says, let there be light, that saying, let there be light, is really not a specific word to create light. It is really just an extension of His infinite self. The appearance of a particular nature attached to a particular creation is really only an appearance from our end. But the truth is that I don't think that summary is going to mean much to you, but let's go further, and we'll see. We'll explain it in better words. We'll explain it more tangibly. Let's go to, sorry everyone, I'm just trying to find the place here. Yeah, here, 975.
Yep.
Last line of 975. Ki'af, although in the English, that's how it starts. Last line on 975.
Okay.
Ki'af. Oh, I forgot part of the review that we as part of the what is the other definitive trait of speech and also thought? We're also going to talk about the divine thought, which is even before the divine speech. What is the definitive nature of these things that distinguishes them from God's kindness? Is that they are expressed in letters. The letters are very important. You may remember from last week. The osios, the letters, the actual letters of the alphabet. The body through which the soul of God's kindness is conveyed at these different levels. There's a level of thought and there's a level of speech. So it comes through the letters, right? That's a part I forgot to mention in my review. We'll discuss more on the letters as we go forth. Okay, last line on 975. Ki af she'enan k'osios machshava shelanu. Even though the letters of God's thought are not like the letters of our thought, chas v'shalom, God forbid, as we're going to talk about, and really as Charles alluded to, that when God thinks, He can create by thinking, right? Unlike us, where we cannot create through thinking, and we can't really, it's hard to even say what we can create by speech, really. It's a little more complex with speech, but whatever. The point is that the Alter Rebbe is setting up for what he's going to say later, which is that these metaphors are obviously inexact, and we have to understand them we have to abstract away from the human conception of these letters and come to a more godly perspective, but we'll get to that. Mikol Makom continues Alter Rebbe, top of 976. Nevertheless, the letters indicate a bringing into existence of light from something into nothing. We're talking about the first day of creation. God says, let there be light. There are letters, right? Yehi 2 words, Hebrew words written in Hebrew letters. Those words indicate that the light is actually brought into existence from something into nothing. Shelechein nivra ha'er.
Nothing into something.
Sorry, what did I say? From something into nothing. Pardon me. That's our job, not God's job. Pardon me. From nothing into something.
Just
Yeah.
reversed. It's okay. We got it.
Shalachein, therefore, nivra ha'or me'amshachas kayach zeh. Therefore, the light is created by drawing forth this power. V'lo nivra mimenu dvarim acherim, and other things are not created by drawing forth this power. Shenivro gam kem midas hachesed, other things which are also created from kindness. Kamay mayim uchiyetze behem, like water and the like. This is a very interesting statement from the Alter Rebbe, and really within this statement is contained a lot of the richness of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The Alter Rebbe is saying like this. Last chapter we talk about the divine kindness. The divine kindness, there's only 10 divine traits, right? If you really want to extend it, you could say 11, you could get clever, but really there's 10 divine traits, okay? We learned in the last chapter, and we're continuing to learn in this chapter, that everything in multiplicity, the multiplicity of all of reality comes from then these 10 things, right? In other words, think of them like 10 primary colors, right? Or 10 basic colors from which you can make the whole palette of all colors, right? In other words, the nature of everything from the cup to the tea within it, to the table it's sitting on, to the air, right, to the clothes we're wearing, the natures of everything with all of their qualities derives from these 10 divine traits. There's only 10 basic traits underlying all of these things. So what makes it that the cup has one nature in many ways, in its color, in its texture, in the fact that it doesn't rise up in the air, right? There's some things which do rise up in the air. If I blow a helium balloon, it rises up. The cup does not rise up, right? If I,
Wait.
yeah.
Just go back about 2 sentences.
Go back 2 sentences?
Yes.
I haven't been counting. The natures of all of these things, the different qualities that all of these creations have, all derive from different combinations of the 10 divine traits.
Okay.
That's where
Full thought.
that's where all of the qualities come from.
Let's think about that for a second.
All of the qualities derive from the different interactions, different combinations of 10 divine traits. How do we see this combination taking place? This combination takes place through the letters. It's through the speech. As we discussed in the first chapter of Shaar HaYichud v'ha'emunah, the first chapter of the part of Tanya we're learning, that what gives water its nature and light its nature is the name by which God speaks it into being, right? So you have one word is and one word is mayim. The different letters combine in different ways, right? You have mem, yud, mem in water. You have aleph, vav, resh in light. The different letters, and the letters derive from the divine traits. The different letters combine differently. What you are seeing when the letters combine to make the true name of something in the holy tongue, what you are seeing is different spheros, different combinations of the divine traits weaving together to produce a reality. Now this is obviously very basic. There's obviously many, many questions that could be asked, right? For example, if the divine word mayim creates water, some water is salty and some is not. Some water is hot, some water is cold. They all come from the word mayim. So we are not saying that there are no traits that are additional to these letters or that require additional explanation on top of this. That's not what we're saying. But what we said, nevertheless, in the first chapter of Tanya still holds true at a general level. The essence of this thing, the soul of what it means to be water, the soul of what it means to be light, come from these 2 different words. And where do the differences in the nature of these 2 things come from? From the way that the letters combine. Now you could say, why in the way the letters combine? Maybe the difference comes from the differences in the divine traits themselves.
It's like the table of substance, but Judaism adds the soul into it. So it's not only the combination of the letter, but the soul that actually comes with it.
So I don't know what that means, but the table of elements in English. I'm not sure if the table of elements is really.
No, that's what I'm saying. But Judaism put the soul into it. It's not only H2O, but it's the one that actually brings the soul of water into water.
H2O, no. We can't get into, if we get into the question of the chemistry of the H2O, we'll be here the whole night. I could just talk about that. That's a different, it's a different issue.
Before you continue,
Yeah.
so the major theme, the major thought here is,
The major thought we're discussing is that the word and the word mayim are both, the word that creates light and the word that creates water are both just infinite expressions of God. Exactly like the divine traits from the previous chapter.
so there are two different words,
Yes.
and each word collectively, or separately and together, are infinite expressions.
Correct. And not just that, they are the same because there's only one infinite expression.
And now, what thought would you like us
Well,
to
one second.
derive from that?
Oh, we're getting there. So, you have the name and you have the name Mayim. Now, what makes this more interesting is that these two substances, light and water, according to the Kabbalah, both derive from the divine kindness. They both come from Chesed. They are both expressions primarily of the divine kindness. In other words, like this. Why is light related to the divine kindness in Kabbalah? Because light is an infinite extension outward, which if you learn what kindness is in the Torah's understanding, that's what kindness is. Kindness is an infinite extension outward. Like Avram, we're reading this week. Avram welcomed all the guests in, and there was no limit to his extension to the other, towards his giving over of himself to others. That's kindness, right? Water, why is water called kindness? Because water, we say, descends from the highest place to the lowest place. And that is also a reflection of kindness. In fact, it sounds almost like what we say about light, very similar, right? So you have kindness is an infinite extension outward. Light keeps on extending. Water flows from the highest place to the lowest place, which is almost different words for the same thing, very similar. And yet, when God says, let there be light, he creates specifically light and not water. When God says, let there be light, he creates specifically light and not water. What does that mean? What that means is that the divine kindness is full of infinite possibilities. The divine kindness by itself could produce water as easily as it produces light, because both of these things derive primarily from that trait. So why is it, says the Alter Rebbe, that when God says, let there be light, right, it is light that's created and not water that's created? Because it is not just the divine kindness in action, in which would produce water and light equally, I suppose. It is the specific words, let there be light, that create the light. In other words, the see how I put this here. Thanks.
But he says, let there be everything that he creates. It's not only for light.
Right, but he says light's name, and it creates light specifically.
We have to be light. It's not light, it's awareness.
No. When the story we're reading, at least what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, is that when God says let there be in the 10 utterances of creation, we're talking about literal physical creation of things. The truth is that in a more fleshed out picture, even in Chassidus, it's much more complicated than that. But the Alter Rebbe is reading it as the simplest, he's talking at the simplest level of the story. When God says let there be light, there's some kind of physical light. Granted, we don't really understand the nature of that physical light. There is no source for that light yet. It's very hard to understand what the light on the first day is. etc., etc. You could make the exact same story with, with fish and water instead of light and water.
Is there a Hebrew word for light that could have a different meaning based on how it's written, how the letters?
Well, it's not light as like lights above.
It's light. It's the physical thing, light, the thing that is illuminating this room and making it not dark.
It's like, light,
comes
it
from
comes
one
like
of the,
vision. There are some, words that you can take out of those, letters. But,
essentially it's a manifestation of one of the 10 traits.
But what we're saying is that it's not just a manifestation of one of the 10 traits, because the 10 traits can manifest in many, many, many ways. In other words, the point the Alter Rebbe is bringing out is that by putting the letters of speech on top of the trait of kindness, you create a direct link to a specific result. In other words, think about it this way. We said before, what's the difference between speech and the trait itself? The trait itself does not exist for an end, right? It doesn't exist for the other. That's what speech is. Speech exists to express myself to the other, right?
You can also speak to yourself.
Yeah, if you want to speak to someone smart. Therefore, concomitantly, in other words, following that structure, that's what the difference between an emotion and speech. The emotion is self-contained. It's an inner experience. Speech is to relate to the other. Carry that through to creation. In the act of creation, what does the kindness itself create? And the answer is it doesn't, because it doesn't exist to create specific things. Right? It is simply God's infinite expression of his own kindness. It doesn't exist to create. Right? There's no specific creation associated with God's kindness itself. We just spent a whole chapter explaining how God's kindness is as infinite as he is. Right? It's not directed towards a particular creation. What does the speech do? The speech takes that kindness and it connects it, it directs it through the letters. It's the letters that make this change. It directs it into a specific end, as what we would call in Lashon HaKodesh, in the Holy Tongue, tachlis, to an end or a purpose.
So kindness is ephemeral, and the speech makes it real.
Kindness is potential, and the speech is what comes of the potential.
You're all saying true things, but you're not understanding the actual point that I'm saying. You're saying things nice, but very generally related to what I'm saying. I'm saying something very specific. The kindness, when it comes through letters of speech, becomes directed toward as a tachlis. Let's try it a different way. What is the purpose of God's kindness? What's it for?
Actually, when you say speech, it doesn't necessarily be kind. With speech, you can also do bad things.
There's other days of creation reflecting the other divine traits. That's not the point. The point is, what is the purpose of God's kindness?
To create.
Why do you say that?
Because
what is God's kindness? Well, we have to go back. If we don't know what it's for, we have to go back to what it is.
Judgment.
What is his kindness? What is God's kindness? We learned in the previous chapter. What's God's kindness?
Judgment.
God's kindness is an infinite reflection of God himself. That's all it is. It's his infinite self-expression. God's kindness is our Ein-Sof.
But how does it look to us?
It doesn't matter.
We don't see the kindness. We see the results of the kindness.
I'm not sure if that's even correct. So what I'm asking you is, what is God's kindness itself? The Sphira, Chesed of Atzilus, God's kindness, God's Chesed, what is it? The answer is, it's like a catechism. We'll repeat, we'll go through and get it word by word. What is God's kindness? God's kindness is Or Ein Sof. God's kindness is the infinite expression of God. What is the infinite expression of God for? The answer is it's not for anything. It's for the same thing God's for. That's the whole point. The whole point is that because it's divine, it's not for anything. How can you say God is for something? If God is for a purpose, he's not God. Similarly, if God's infinite self-expression, which is just the fullness of his being, his natural state, so to speak, not for now, but what is that for? Well, the details are not for now. But what is that for? It's for the same thing God is for. It's simply God's being. That's all it is. That's what God's kindness is. God's kindness is a ray of the sun in the sun. There is no divine kindness. There is only God. There is no ray. There is only the luminary. So what is God's kindness for? It's not for anything, right? So how can you say that God's kindness is for creating what is created on the first day of creation? And the answer...
Slow down.
Yeah.
How can you say...
That God's kindness
Slow down.
is for what is created on the first day of creation. Because the first day of creation is associated with kindness. The second is with gvura. In which case, one second, in which case Eyal is correct on the second day, that not all speech is kind, because on the second day God speaks and creates. Of separation, rakia, a gvura thing, a discipline thing, a non-kind thing, right? And so to all the other traits with all the other days. So if God's kindness is not for a purpose, then how can it be that one day of creation, so to speak, emerges from, to use popular science language, emerges from God's kindness specifically? You understand the question? It's like saying, what is it about a human being that when a human mother gives birth, she gives birth to a human and not to an elephant? Let me ask you a weird question. Why does a human mother give birth to a human baby and not to an elephant baby? Or puppies?
Ooh, that would be nice.
The answer is...
The genetics?
Exactly, it's in her nature, and the nature of a human being is to produce other human beings. I could ask you a similar question. Why does an acorn grow into an oak tree and not into a giraffe? Yeah? Because the acorn has something about it, right, that it has what's called in Lashon HaKodesh, what's called in Hebrew, in the language of Chassidus, a tachlus, an end or a purpose, and it is made to produce that thing. What is the Alter Rebbe saying in this line? He's saying that when does purpose, as we understand it in our world, first arise? First in the divine speech only, right? Not in the divine intellect, not in the divine kindness or the divine emotional traits. The idea of purpose, that one aspect of the divine produces a specific result, is only in the speech. If you go back to God's kindness itself, it's like the mother could give birth to puppies or elephants, doesn't matter what day it is. In one day chesed produces water, a different day chesed produces right? What makes it produce, what gives it an end directed to, what gives it a direction toward one specific result, is the letters of the divine speech. That's what turns kindness, which could produce an infinite number of different things, produce light specifically on the first day.
Chesed.
Yeah.
So the very word chesed,
Yeah.
correct, which is the word we're speaking about, correct? Has purpose because it was spoken.
That wasn't spoken.
No.
Well, you're trying to make a meta assessment of what we mean when we speak the word chesed, right? It's, I don't know if we can withstand it at the moment. But it's a good point. It's a good point. How can we name all of these things that are beyond the level that we're talking about, which is where we say speech begins? It's a very good question. It's a good question.
I mean, if you say that God spoke, but we don't really know what God, that spoke means at the God level.
Right. Well, I've told you what it means in general, what the metaphor is. The metaphor is that it means he's relating to the other. He's relating to something outside of himself. That's what speech means.
Okay. So God relates beyond himself.
Yep.
Chesed.
His chesed relates to something outside of itself, yeah. Call that light. Call that light.
Okay. And light is a physical manifestation?
Correct. Of God, and not just God, but of God's kindness. And why is it that light is produced rather than water, which is also a physical manifestation of God's kindness?
Let me just
of
visualize
course.
the first part one of this, which is that chesed is manifested into light. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your subsidiary question is, why did it become light and not something else?
Oh, that's what he wanted.
Correct.
Okay. And is there an answer to that?
Yes, because he spoke the words, let there be light, rather than let there be something else.
We need to be careful with the word, spoke, because even when you talk about Ma'amad al-Sinai, when the Torah was given, then it says, וישמעו את הקולות, ויראו את הקולות. It's like, the noise was actually sin, not heard, but sin. That's what it says when God is speaking. So we don't really understand exactly what does it mean, when God spoke. It's like, it's something that makes something.
Well, through speech we gain understanding.
Well, but it's not necessarily...
But maybe
it
God's
doesn't have to be,
maybe God's speech wasn't coming like we hear sound,
so
speech. It might have
somehow
been
it's-
It did something.
it was a
something happened we
manifestation
understand.
Yes.
that created, and boom, it was there.
Yeah.
It was a boom theory, maybe. All of a sudden, it's light.
Yeah.
And he gave that a name.
But I'm trying to get to the preamble thought. And the preamble thought is we're trying to understand what? That
This divine speech is itself truly infinite and truly one with God, just like his kindness.
I think
And I
that's
think the kindness
that's an
is-
easier thought to understand.
What is?
That all the things that we are trying to characterize with different names,
It's kindness.
metaphorically,
it's one.
are all part of one,
Of course.
and it just so happens that they get manifested.
They don't get manifested.
Well, we put
God-
it in language that
God
we understand,
gave
but
it
for
a
God is
name.
one.
Okay,
And
but
then the name.
that's an easier understand. It's almost easier to say, it's the fabric, and the fabric somehow emerges in certain ways.
It's one.
Do it in quiz form, okay? Ask a question where almost like multiple choice, A, B, or C. What does this mean?
I'll start making papers. According to what we've been saying, what's the difference between, let's put it this way, what's the difference between a cup of water fulfilling its purpose and light in a room fulfilling its purpose?
The purpose.
The purpose is the difference. In other words, they have different purposes, right? Let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm not saying it's so simple at all, but let's say water's purpose is to make human beings not thirsty and able to survive and serve God. And let's say light's purpose is to illuminate darkness so that we can see what we need to see, ultimately also in order to be able to serve God. Okay? So let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm making it simple. They only have one purpose. The purpose is very simple. Light's purpose is to illuminate. Water's purpose is to drink. That's essentially what water's for. Okay. There's a school of thought. I'm going to tell you the traditional way of thinking about it, and then I'm going to tell you why what the Alter Rebbe is saying upends that whole way of thinking about it. Okay? The traditional way of thinking about morality, but it's broader than the modern sense of the term morality, not just in human decision making, but really in what it means for anything to be good. Not just a good person, but a good cup of water or a good ray of light, for example. What is goodness? What does it mean for a cup of water to be a good cup of water? And the answer is, it depends on the purpose of the thing. If the purpose of the water is to make me not thirsty anymore, then filtered water is better than seawater. It's better water, objectively, right? Relative to that purpose. Is the point I just said clear? Some water is better for that purpose, some water is worse for that purpose, right? You could say the exact same thing about light, right? A red bulb, like in a dark room, right? If the purpose of light is so you could be able to study Torah, let's say, then the red bulb in a dark room is not as good as the light bulbs that we have in this room. Some light is less aligned with bringing that purpose into being, and some is more aligned with bringing that purpose into being, right? What's the common denominator between the light and the water? That we look at what the purpose of the thing is by nature. What does it produce, so to speak, in a very metaphysical, a very rough sense? What does it produce? What does it cause that fulfills the purpose for which it is created? It has a nature. That nature is directed toward a certain tachlis, a certain purpose, a certain end. And how well does it fulfill that tachlis? So what is the root of all purpose? The root of all purposes, again, we are going to upend this in a second. The root of all purposes in the traditional view is in the nature of the thing itself. You look at what the thing is, and that tells you what it's for, and how well it is fulfilling what it's for.
Well, that's a utility.
It depends how you think about it. There's different ways of thinking about it, but we say in Judaism that everything is created for a purpose, right? Everything has a purpose. That is the sense of purpose in which I mean. Okay. So a different way of saying that purpose comes from the thing's nature is that a purpose comes from the thing's soul, right? Which is not such a big leap, because the soul is inherently, whatever the soul is, without defining it for the moment, but whatever the soul is, we know, we intuit, it's intuitively obvious that the soul of the thing is very much wrapped up in the purpose of the thing, right? The soul of water has something about it that it can quench my thirst for the purpose.
We're not giving the water's soul consciousness. We're just saying.
Yeah, we're saying as its deepest nature is really what the soul is, just a different word for here. The soul is a word for its deepest nature, right? Now, all of this is all well and good if, and only if, you want to say that the deepest nature and the deepest purpose of a thing is not godly. This all only works if you want to say the deepest nature and the deepest purpose of a thing is not godly. And by not godly, I mean very specifically is itself. So let me rephrase it with that word. This all only works if you want to say that the deepest nature and the deepest purpose of a thing is a function of itself. Right? In other words, the deepest nature of water, which is very much wrapped up in the purpose of water, is to make people less thirsty. Right? How do I know that? Because I looked at water, I looked at the soul of water, the deepest nature of water, and on water's terms, I see that is the function, that is the purpose of water. That is the end, the tachlis towards which it is directed. What's the problem? The problem is that by this measure, right, the goodness of a thing has nothing to do with its godliness. And in fact, traditionally, the philosophies that have believed what I have just explained to you have all believed that the creation is separate from Hashem. They are non-mystical philosophies. These are all philosophies, and I don't mean, God forbid, the impure philosophies. I mean holy Jewish philosophies from Jewish philosophers. These philosophies all believe that when God creates the cup of water, the water attains independence from God, and therefore attains its own inner nature and its own purpose, right? The Alter Rebbe in the whole Tanya, as should be obvious at this juncture in chapter 11, is arguing the exact opposite. The Alter Rebbe is arguing that water never attains a separate nature from God. It never attains an independent soul by which water can be judged on its own terms, right? Water is one with godliness. That's what we've been studying in every chapter of this book in a different way. That the water is absolutely one with godliness. It never attains its own end, right? This is Chassidus' and more broadly Judaism's radical perspective, right? And I just want to, I can't help myself but speak about it in terms of the Parsha this week, because it's Hashgacha Pratis that we're learning this in Parshas Vayera. It's divine providence that we're learning it now. Because in this week's Parsha you have the Akedah, the famous story of how Abraham binds Isaac upon the altar and is willing to sacrifice him to God, right? Which is at the same time a very mysterious episode and clearly one of the central pillars of the whole Judaism. This story is absolutely fundamental to Judaism, right? Even though it's very difficult to wrap your mind around, bizarre, strange, hard to understand what's going on, but it is equally clear that those who did understand it, the sages and the prophets and sages and elders through all the generations, have viewed this story as an absolutely central pillar to Judaism. It's absolutely foundational. We read it every day. We read it every day to inspire our own service of God. It's essential to Judaism. Between Judaism and the Akedah, you cannot drive a wedge. It's like the two things are absolutely one, right? The Rebbe explains that just a simple, maybe not, just a small slice of this story, just a small, like a little crack in the wall that you can understand a little bit what's going on. The Rebbe explains as follows, and it's really the same thing we're talking about here. The Rebbe explains as follows. He says, what is so special about Abraham offering Yitzchak, offering Isaac on the altar, right? If you want to say it's self-sacrifice, right, then there's been self-sacrifice through all of Jewish history, unfortunately, in every generation. Jews have given not just their lives, but even their child's lives for the sanctification of God's name. It's a recurring theme of Jewish history, unfortunately, right? And in fact, you could say that most of those people, God did not ask them directly to do it. In other words, the later people who did it without God even asking them directly, right, like he asked Abraham, they were even greater. Because if God came and asked me to do it directly, okay, that's maybe less challenging, right? You have Jews who are willing to sacrifice themselves and their children for the sanctification of God's name without God ever coming to them. They weren't prophets, right? So what's so special about the Akedah, right? So the answer Chassidus gives is that what's special about the Akedah, one of the answers Chassidus gives, is that what's special about the Akedah is that the Akedah was the first. Kol hascholos kashes, as we say in Judaism, all beginnings are difficult. In other words, spiritually speaking, where do you think that ability, that potential for self-sacrifice in all generations of Jews comes from? It was drawn into the world by our forefather Avraham. That's what we're reading in the Akedah. There did not exist in the world this reality of self-sacrifice in this way, and Abraham drew it into the world.
Okay, so bring it back now to...
No, we're not ready to bring it back yet. Not ready. If I brought it back now, it wouldn't work.
No, but sacrifice was there.
What?
The idolship worker, I mean, that's what they did.
Sorry?
The idolship worker, they sacrificed, man.
One second. I'm not done yet. 1 second. So the we're not ready. The question is on this. So Chassidus says that Abraham's self-sacrifice at the Akedah was the first and brought self-sacrifice into the world. The question is, even in the story of Avraham, we find him himself having self-sacrifice many years earlier, because as we know, the 10th test of Abraham is the Akedah. One of the first tests is when Nimrod threatened to throw him into the fiery furnace for spreading the word of God, and Abraham says, I'm willing to die for my beliefs, and he's thrown into the furnace, and miraculously he's saved from being burned by the furnace. A famous midrash every child learns in Cheder, right? That Avraham was saved from being burned by this furnace. In other words, not only do we find earlier in history that there's self-sacrifice, we find that Avraham himself, earlier in his own story, there's self-sacrifice. So why do we read about the Akedah every day? Why is the Akedah the pillar of Judaism? We should read about the fiery furnace every day, right? So the answer is like this. The answer is that the self-sacrifice at the Akedah was the first instance of truly Jewish self-sacrifice. What do we mean by truly Jewish self-sacrifice? What we mean is that Avram had so much self-sacrifice that he was willing to give up not just his own life, not just the life of his son, but all of his spiritual aspirations to godliness as well. God comes to Avram at the beginning of this week's parsha, and he tells him that godliness will be spread in the world through your son who's going to be born to you a day, right? This is the story of the three angels. They come and they tell him, and Sarah laughs, right? They say, you're going to have a son a year from now, and that son is going to continue your... Avram had no children except Yishmael, who unfortunately we read in this week's parsha was not didn't follow in the way of Avram, right? So he thinks he has no legacy. Right, he thinks he's not going to, his line is going to end, right? He's in a way, the world's only religious monotheist in a way, and he's not going to have any legacy. And God sends him the angels who tell him, there's going to be a son born to you, and that son is going to, through him, you're going to become a whole people, right? There's going to be a whole Jewish people that come from you, right? Then, not long later, God comes to, a few decades later, God comes to Avram and tells him, kill that son. In other words, what Avram was sacrificing was not just his physical self, and not just his physical son. What he was sacrificing was all of his absolute deepest and profoundest visions of his own worship of God. He was willing to set aside his own avodas Hashem, his own service of God, the mission that he thought God had sent him on. He was able to put that aside. In other words, you cannot compare the self-sacrifice of an idolater. I always think about I think of the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire and for protesting Vietnam, right? It's the front of a Rage Against the Machine album cover, if you're into that sort of thing. Anyway, you can't compare that self-sacrifice to the self-sacrifice of the Akedah. They're worlds apart. Anyone of any religion, of any group, can have self-sacrifice as a martyr to further their cause, right? So what's the difference between martyrdom to further your cause, like, by the way, Avram at Ur Kasdim, where it was a public trial and he was willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace in the name of having one God, and people would see that he was willing to die for his beliefs, and on the contrary, God's name would become famous and sanctified through Avram's self-sacrifice. Right? Contrast that with the Akedah, where not only is he destroying his own line, but there's no one around even to see. There's not going to be any story of the Akedah if he kills Yitzchak. There's no one around there to know and to see and to recognize his self-sacrifice. In all likelihood, most people probably wouldn't have even have realized it as a good thing. They would have thought it was a death cult. Who knows, right? So in other words, you can't compare either the Buddhist monk or Lahavdil Avram in the fiery furnace with Avram at the Akedah. What's the essential difference? How would you say it in soul terms? That's this in simple words. In soul terms, in Chassidic terms, what is the difference between Avram at Ur Kasdim and Avram at the Akedah? Avram in the fiery furnace and Avram at the binding of Isaac. The difference is that at the fiery furnace, Abraham becomes more of a Metzias. He would have become more of a something by dying in the fiery furnace. True, not in his own individual life, but as becoming part of a greater cause, he would become not nothing, he would become part of something much, much greater. The being willing to become a martyr is a willingness to leave your small being and become a much more substantial and eternal being.
Okay, we have to get back.
I'm getting there. Avram, I haven't lost my train of thought. Avram at the Akedah, at the binding of Isaac, is about totally ending his own existence. Yeah. I don't worship God in the way I understand. I don't worship God in a way I can appreciate. I don't worship God in a way that I'm going to sacrifice for a greater good. There is no greater good. To Avram, the greater good is that God's name should be sanctified and spread out over all the world. Right? He's a monotheist. He believes God, everyone should worship the one God. That's what his deepest desire is, his deepest holy desire. And he goes against that desire He goes against all of his understanding in his very being. He is totally able to set himself aside and literally become nothing. How is that connected to what we're learning in Tanya? What we're learning right now, is that everything in its original source, in God's traits, starts as nothing. Why does it have to start as nothing? Because God is infinite and present, right? Remember what I said before. Think back. The purpose of the cup of water, according to worldly philosophy, we judge it by its own function and its own nature, right? In Judaism, that's not how we look at it. We look at, if the water is still here, what does that mean? Can't be here? God can't be here. If the water with its nature is here, how can God be here with his presence and with his infinite nature? So in other words, if you'll just stick with me for a moment, when does the water, at what juncture does the water or the physical light attain this purpose that it has, this urkazdim purpose, right? Its own end, its own being that it needs to fulfill, whose purpose needs to be furthered in terms of its own being. It attains that at the level of speech. It's what we read about in the first chapter of Genesis. When God says, "Let there be light," what is he saying? He's saying that until now, there's been only me and my traits, my kindness, but what is my kindness? Nothing other than me. What nature does my kindness have? None of its own, only mine. That's what we spent the whole last chapter talking about. It has only my nature, right? But now I want to create something that appears to have its own nature, that appears to have its own purpose and its own end, right? Before now, everything was a constant akeda. Before now, everything was a constant binding of Isaac. Everything knew that it was nothing. All there was here was me. Now, I'm going to create something which has its own nature and its own purpose and its own end, right? What the Alter Rebbe is saying in this one line is, where does that begin? It begins when God says, "Let there be light." The words create that reality. Why? Why is it that the nature of the light derives from these words? Because the words take what is an infinite divine kindness and they attach to them this idea of tachlis, this idea of purpose, this idea of being directed towards a single end. All of a sudden, it's not just God's infinite being with no purpose. All of a sudden, there is a purpose. He says, "Let there be light." The purpose of those words, what do those words create specifically? Light. So where does light get this nature of being, this nature of apparent independence, that it is directed towards certain ends that are not God's? Where do we get a being to be thrown into a fiery furnace who has his own schemes and his own purposes other than God's? It all comes from these divine words, right? With this in mind, it's super late, isn't it?
No, fine.
Yeah, okay, it's not too bad. With this in mind, we can understand the chidush, the innovation of what the Alter Rebbe is going to say in this chapter, that even the words that God speaks are absolutely one with him, just like his traits, right? Think about it. Even the words that he speaks, like "let there be light," are absolutely one with him as much as the trait of kindness. In other words, what appears to create the very thing that creates a separate being with its own purpose and its own ends, which is judged on its own terms, the very source of that independent reality, that separate thing, the very place where this idea of a separate purpose other than God's comes from, that very place is purposeless, infinite, and absolutely one with God. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying in this chapter. He's saying that the Akedah and the source of Ur Kasdim, the Akedah and the source of the Buddhist monk, Lahavdil, really come from the exact same place, right? It doesn't look that way from the outside. To us, there's a difference. But what he's going to say is that this apparent separation, this apparent purpose that things have on their own terms, right, is really not true. From God's perspective, all there is, even in the specific words, he says specific words which creates light specifically. That itself is infinite and is no different than the words that create water specifically. Right? You understand? This is much harder to understand than what we said previously. Much harder. The divine kindness is a divine trait that's infinite. We don't even really know what it is, right? We're saying something that's solid. If you look at the nature of water and you look at the nature of light, you cannot escape that these are two different things with different realities in our world. Where do those different, what's the seed of those differences is the purpose for which they are created. The source of those different purposes are from different divine utterances. And the Alter Rebbe is going to say that the two different divine utterances, let there be water and let there be light, are really absolutely one and the same and identical, just like God's traits are absolutely one and the same and identical. In other words, what has all been very up in the sky, so to speak, in the previous chapters is now coming home. It's coming home to roost. The Alter Rebbe is saying what's true of God's traits is true of the source of the Yeshus, the source of the independence, of the separate beingness of the world itself. That itself, the very source of separation and independence, is absolutely and utterly united with God, just like his own traits. That's what the Alter Rebbe is going to say. Yes.
When
questions? My spiel is done. Yeah.
Abraham has to take his son to the altar.
Yeah.
Is that his intellect?
No.
And his understanding
No.
of what
No.
God is wishing of him?
No.
Or is it just because
No,
of
it's super rational
faith?
dedication. It's faith.
Okay.
It's faith. It's super rational dedication.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Might have had a premonition also. That
No, it's not.
He
I
had
mean-
knowledge that God told him one thing. The worst you could say is that on the way up in the mountains, he says, gee, why did he change his mind?
But I think Abraham probably gets an intellect sometime maybe later on in the story.
Right. There's some.
Because right now he's doing something that he can't be thinking logically
No.
why this has to happen.
It's super rational devotion.
I
Yeah,
guess.
but he started off different.
What do you mean?
He was born with different.
It's not a matter
He was
of-
born an idol worshiper. Oh, you mean he was born with special traits and
I don't think he
abilities?
was-
That's certainly true. That's certainly true that he
That's
was
what
born with certain
divided
talents.
him from
No,
the
but
others.
but the thing is that he arrived at all of this intellectually on his own power. And the truth is that until you appreciate that, you don't really appreciate Avram, because the whole point is that it's not that Avram was like this starry-eyed dreamer who like he had no rational thought. On the contrary, it's like the world's greatest philosopher and greatest academic who knows more than everyone else. He arrived at the recognition of God purely on his own understanding, with no help, with not being raised that way in a world that was not that way. He arrived at that understanding totally on his own, and then at the age of 90-something, right, God actually appears to him and says, by the way, I'm not just the object of your philosophy, I'm actually here, and you should move to Israel. And what does he do? He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't hesitate. He picks up like a 5-year-old being spoken to by their father, and he just goes. That's the greatness of Avram, which is why the Hayom Yom says, I don't know if the Hayom Yom says that the greatness of Avram, right, the very famous Hayom Yom that's associated with this week, that the Rebbe Rashab went crying and asked, he asked, why is it that when he was a child, the Rebbe Rashab cried, and he asked, as his little child, how come this week's parasha begins that God appeared to Avram, and he cried and he asked, why did God appear to Avram and he doesn't appear to me, right? And you remember what the answer was? The answer was that when a Jew decides at the age of whatever it was to circumcise himself for God, then he's worthy of God appearing to him. Right? What's the point of that? It's not the physical act of the circumcision that's so remarkable. It's the super rational dedication that Avram was able to do. Most people are set in their ways by 20 years old. Avram had more intellectual wherewithal. In other words, he had more reason to be set in his ways. And he wasn't 20, he was 90-something. And what was he willing to do? He was willing to kick over all those blocks and do exactly what God says, like a simple Jew. He was able to be in a state, he reached a state of faith that I have nothing to myself, I have no understanding, whatever God says is good for me. Yeah? Most people with a billionth of Avram's intellect and a zillionth of his experience are not able to do that. That's what's special about Avram.
Imagine you dream a dream in your night, and in the morning you say, I'm going to do it. It's like,
Okay.
Well, there's something to
That's enough for 1 week.
involved in that. Am I